Hello, Combination, and welcome back to Let's Combinate. I'm your host, Subhi today. On this episode, we're going to be covering a really important topic as far as combination products go, and that is dissecting the differences between drug tech transfer and device design transfer. Now, if you've been working in combination products at all, you know that when it comes to translating specifications into production, it's one of the most challenging things in a drug space. One element of that is related to terminology. One element of that is related to culture. So in this episode, we're going to cover the regulations, what they say as far as design versus tech transfer. We're going to talk about how these elements are applied separately. And then we're also going to talk about some areas where there's some cross-pollination. So I hope you enjoy this episode. First, let's talk about drug transfer, more commonly known as tech transfer. Now, in the pharma world, this refers to the handoff from the development phase of a product life cycle, whether it's R&D or early stage clinical trials to full-scale commercial production. Now, drug transfer is governed by a lot of regulatory guidelines, but one of the most comprehensive frameworks as far as this goes is ICH Q10. You know, if you haven't dealt with it, it outlines the pharmaceutical quality system, or PQS, and tech transfer is one of its 4 key enablers. So ICH Q10 helps us structure how knowledge moves between departments, sites, or even companies, ensuring that critical quality attributes, CQAs, of a drug product are maintained when you scale up. So one element of tech transfer is analytical method transfer. So you've got these analytical test methods, what you're going to use to qualify your drug during development. As you move to commercial manufacturing, those methods need to be transferred and sometimes validated on different equipment or even at a different facility. Another element of tech transfer is process scale up. So scaling up the small scale production often happens in a lab or pilot plant if you've worked in a R&D facility that has had that. But full scale productions means commercial batch sizes. And the batch size setting process on the drug side becomes really, really important when you consider elements like how you're going to sample and test the product. Process scale up, the reason it's so important is because you need to ensure the process behaves the same way when it's scaled, which is critical for drugs where even minor changes in the process parameters can affect safety or efficacy. And then the third prong, so to speak, as far as tech transfer goes, is process validation. And regulatory bodies like FDA or EMA will want to see solid evidence that your manufacturing process is repeatable, consistent, that what it's producing is of high quality, and that the products meet requirements every single time. So this is where ICH Q10 aligns with Part 211 for drug CGMPs in the US to ensure that everything's in order. Now, one of the major challenges during drug transfer is ensuring that as your scale increases, you're not inadvertently introducing variability, where a small change in something like an excipient or even the mixing process could impact your drug's performance. And that's where risk management is really important and comes into play. And those elements are outlined in ICH Q9. Now, let's shift gears and talk about design transfer for medical devices. This is a little bit different. The reason that I wanted to illustrate this is, you kind of have a difference in intent when it comes to drug and devices, which means the elements that you prioritize are going to be inherently different. While drug transfer focuses on chemical and biological stability, design transfer for devices is all about getting your design ready for production. In the medical device world, the regulatory framework that really governs design transfer is 13485, specifically Section 7.3. Where it gets important is that ISO 13485 outlines that during design transfer, you have to establish documented procedures to ensure that the device is correctly translated into production specifications. Essentially, it's about making sure that what's on the engineer's drawing board can actually be manufactured reliably and consistently. Another key regulation is obviously 820, known as the QSR. In as far as U.S. design transfer goes, it's covered in under design control, and it's not a whole lot that's given there. It just says that it requires that manufacturing establish procedures to ensure that the device design is correctly transferred into production. Now, the recent QMSR updates in the U.S. is becoming even more harmonized with 13485. And so more or less, there really isn't a difference between the two. So, what are the elements that go into completion of a design transfer? The first one, DHF, finalizing your DHF. So this file is your device's biography. It captures everything from your initial design inputs, your design verification, your design validation, to the final design outputs, which are then handed off into manufacturing. Second element is process validation. So much like on the drug transfer side, you need to validate the manufacturing process so you can consistently produce devices that meet specifications. So this includes things like, the common V model of process validation, IQ, OQ, DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ, risk management, where 14971 comes into play as far as risk management goes, isn't just about dealing with design and user risk. You need to talk about the risks that are associated with the manufacturing process. This is commonly dealt with in a PFMEA. So, as far as the design process goes, one of the major challenges for device manufacturers is ensuring the design for manufacturability and assembly of the product. Now, this area I've done a lot of work in design for manufacturing and assembly, and at one of the big medical device manufacturers that I worked at, we would look at our hardware products and dissect the design and look at where are there redundancies in the design, where are there parts that we can eliminate. Adhesives, fasteners were usually first on the list if you could integrate features that would nest the product into it, or have features that would allow for some kind of inherent fastening versus separate screws and things like that. Like I said, adhesives as well. But other things would be considered as well, whether or not the parts were symmetrical. And then as far as assembly goes, how much in design intent are you applying to, if it's small scale production, the human being able to assemble product. So things like poka-yoke design. But also if it's coming into automated production, how much are you considering the real manufacturing process? So, things like caps that go pull ring caps on some devices. Are you considering how it's going to vibrate through the feeder bowl, and whether or not they're going to get tangled on each other and things like that? So those things are really important to discuss when you're designing your equipment, because they can have huge ramifications in the future. So that's just kind of painting the picture, broad brush. If you've worked in the space, you probably know all of that. If you haven't, it kind of sets the foundation for what we're going to talk about next, which is what are the key differences between drug transfer, drug tech transfer, and device design transfer. First, complexity. In the drug transfer space, the focus is on the chemistry, making sure the purity, potency, stability, and in quality, you hear the acronym CISPQ, that those things are dealt with well in production and can meet requirements consistently. In the device design transfer space, however, it's more about the physical design, making sure that the device functions properly, meets performance standards, and can be reliably manufactured. And so just, one thing that is really important to just think about is that, yes, the container closure of a drug is important, but ultimately what's important is what's inside the container. And from that point of view, the finished result is a chemical entity. And on the device side, you're talking about something that is a widget that is produced in a 3D envelope, which, you would, one of the episodes that I did in the last year that really spoke to me and is one of the reasons that I wanted to do this series on drugs versus devices is Larry Mager, who was the first interview of the show. He is a dyed-in-the-wool device quality management SME, but he's branched off and focused on things that are beyond quality and more focused on performance. And he's fantastic. He pretty late into his career, having been in devices for 30 plus years, started doing projects where he would focus on things like clinical trials on the drug side, like CROs, and started dealing with combination product manufacturers. And he understood the differences in the complexity and the regulation, but because he's so technically focused, when he was talking about the product quality, in other words, releasing the product based on the understanding of the requirements, he came to the realization that the difference between drugs and devices is how you measure quality. So this first thing is just understanding that the end result that you're producing on the drug side is a chemical entity that's sealed in a primary container. On the device side is something that is produced in a 3D world that is assembled versus mixed. In other words, you're not going to consider the homogeneity of a batch of devices in the same way that you would consider a batch of drug product that was all mixed in the same drug product drum. Next is the regulatory submission differences. So on the drug side, the CMC section of a regulatory submission, which stands for Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Control, takes the lead. For devices, you're dealing with either a PMA or a 510K submission. Combination requires, may deal with, if it's primary mode of action drug, you're going to be dealing in the drug space, vice versa when it comes to devices. And finally, process validation. So for drugs, it's all about ensuring the consistency of the chemical process. For devices, you're focused on design reproducibility. Does the device work the same way every time it's produced? This is particularly important for the CTQs, the device CTQs, things like dose accuracy in drug delivery devices. And we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of essential performance requirements or EDDOs, but whether it's drugs and devices, you have an element of trying to characterize those things that are really important. So on the device side, you tend to have CTQ characteristics. I've seen a lot of different ways that different companies highlight these things, whether it's flagging a dimension on a drawing as a CTQ, or going into the spec and putting in bold that this is something that is a CTQ, or in a process, something like the seal strength of a process, or the seal time of a process, or the seal temperature of a process. Those things are inherent. Whereas for drugs, I think one of the things that's a little bit different is that, with the way that things are moving towards with ICH Q12 and established characteristics, is that the CQAs or CPP, the critical quality attributes or critical performance parameters, those things are set in stone, and those things end up being considered sort of your drug product manufacturing backbone, such that a change to one of those things, once submitted, requires a submission and approval prior to, and maybe we'll do an episode on ICH Q12 in another time. Now, I wanted to end off with just talking about commercialization for combination products. So how does it all come together when we talk about combination products? First, one of the biggest hurdles is synchronizing timelines for drug and device components. Drug development and device engineering often operate on very different schedules depending on the company maturity. This can cause friction if one is ready to transfer before the other. And so having a project management approach that integrates both the timelines is really important. The other thing is, as far as regulatory submission goes, they're more complex for combination products. So you'll need to satisfy both the pharma and device regulatory bodies, particularly when you're going into Europe, where they're kind of still separate. On the U.S. side, they do. You're doing one submission, and then it's the same. To use the EU terminology, it's the same. FDA is the competent authority that deals with both drugs and devices, whereas in Europe, you kind of have two separate dealings with the notified body versus the competent authority, whether it's local or EMA overall. The FDA, they will usually assign a lead center, whether it's CDER or CDRH, depending on the primary mode of action, but generally both are involved. Another consideration is supply chain. Managing the sourcing, manufacturing, quality checks for both drug and device requires communication between suppliers. We did a whole episode on PPAP. I did one by myself where I talked about, PPAP in a little more detail, and I did one with my good friend Ben Lockwood, where we kind of broke down material qualification in drugs versus devices. So check that out if you're interested. But often drugs and device components are produced in different facilities, right? So establishing clear quality agreements or clear understanding of, what the bar that there is some level of consistent bar being set by the drug and device side is crucial for managing responsibilities. And then lastly, post-market surveillance. So you may be thinking, what does post-market surveillance have to do with design transfer? And so when it comes to tech transfer, like we were talking about, we're talking about making sure that the chemical product can be made in a way that's consistent. When it comes to device design transfer, you're also looking at some other key commercialization elements typically. So a design transfer checklist would not only include, has your spec been translated to your internal manufacturing or your CMO, but it'll include, have you also transferred the required commonly needed control procedures? So things like complaint handling, things like safety and MDR reporting, medical device reporting. So don't forget about post-market surveillance. And so to wrap it up, drug transfer and device design transfer might seem like they share really similar goals, but the execution is very different. Whether you're working with a drug, device, or combination product, understanding these distinctions and planning for them is essential to making sure that you have successful commercialization. I hope today's breakdown helped you navigate your own journey from development to market. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the channel or roadblocks that you're seeing. And as I always say, my goal is mastery. And so rather than dive into the weeds, I kind of wanted to zoom out and talk about things that are a little bit more high level. But I'd love to hear from you. If this is too watered down and kiddie pooly, then let me know. Or if if you'd like to see things that are much more detailed, talking about each separate element, would love to hear your feedback. And with that in mind, let's simplify by combinating. Thanks, everybody.